Season 2, Chapter 2. Moses, when the law stood above the ruler. Before Aristotle asked what makes government just, before Rome debated the rule of law, before America created a constitution, there was another ancient tradition that asked a fundamental question: who is greater, the ruler or the law? And in the biblical tradition, one of the most important figures in that story was Moses. According to the Hebrew Bible, Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into the wilderness. But the story wasn't simply about escaping one ruler. It was about becoming a people governed by a covenant and a set of laws. Their journey eventually brought them to Mount Sinai. And there, according to the biblical tradition, something extraordinary happened. Moses received the laws by which the community was to live. The Torah contains far more than the 10 Commandments. It addresses property, debt, courts, crime, family, treatment of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. It wasn't simply a collection of rules for government to enforce. It presented a way of life in which human beings were accountable for how they treated one another. Justice was not limited to the powerful, and here is where the story becomes especially interesting. The ancient world already had sophisticated legal traditions. Kings such as Hammurabi presented themselves as establishers of justice. But the biblical tradition presented law differently. The ultimate source of the law was not the king. It was God. Moses was the mediator who received and transmitted the law, and that created a powerful principle. Human authority was not the highest authority. And the story makes the principle even more powerful. Moses himself was not above the law. Near the end of his life, the biblical narrative says that Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land. He could see it from a distance, but he would not enter it. The message was striking. Even the greatest leader was accountable to something greater than himself. The Torah also repeatedly returns to the idea that the vulnerable must not simply be forgotten. The poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Deuteronomy makes social justice one of its major themes. The message was that a society could not call itself just merely because it had laws. The way it treated people mattered. Centuries later, other civilizations would develop their own ideas about law, justice, citizenship, and government. Aristotle would ask what makes a political community just. Roman thinkers would debate law and citizenship. Later philosophers would argue about natural rights and the limits of government. And eventually, those questions would become part of the intellectual world inherited by the American founders. These traditions were not identical. They did not form one straight line, but they were wrestling with some of the same enormous questions. Who has the right to rule? What makes a law just? And is anyone powerful enough to stand above the law? Thousands of years ago, the story of Moses offered an answer. The ruler is not the law. The ruler is accountable to it. And perhaps that is one of the oldest questions in the history of civilization. So before there was America, there were questions. Before there was a constitution, there were ideas. And one of the oldest questions remains: what is government for? This is where our journey begins. Before there was America, history doesn't just tell us where we've been. It helps us understand where we're going. If you enjoyed this insight, please like, subscribe, and follow Eternal Insights for more timeless wisdom from history's greatest minds. Until next time, keep learning from the past to build a better future.